There's a knife sitting in a junk drawer somewhere in rural Ohio right now. It's been there for 30 years. The bone handle has gone dark from decades of skin oil. The blades are still sharp. Whoever last owned it made sure of that. But nobody in that house knows what it is, where it came from, or why it matters. That knife built this country, and the story of how America forgot it is the story of how America forgot something much bigger than a blade. Today we're counting down 10 pocket knives that fed workers, saved lives, built industries, and quietly disappeared from American pockets. Most of them before you were born. Some of these patterns were carried by millions of men for over a century. Some were so specialized they solved problems that modern tools still can't match. Every single one of them is mostly gone now, not broken, not worn out, just forgotten. Let's start the count. Most people who know anything about American knife history know the Barlow. Mark Twain put it in the hands of Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn. George Washington's mother reportedly gave him a small one as a boy, and that knife sits in a display case in Alexandria, Virginia, to this day. The Barlow is the knife that crossed the Atlantic with the colonists and never went back. But the knife most people picture when they hear the word Barlow is the standard version, the one that measured about 3.5 inches closed, the one boys carried to school and farmers kept in their overalls. That knife is famous. What isn't famous is its bigger brother. The Granddaddy Barlow measured 5 full inches closed. The blade ran nearly 4 inches when open. Russell's company, the Green River Works, out of Greenfield, Massachusetts, the same operation that first mass-produced the American Barlow back in 1875, divided their production into 2 groups, the standard Barlow for everyday carry, and the Granddaddy for men whose everyday work demanded something closer to a short fixed blade that could still fold into a pocket. Lumberjacks in the Pacific Northwest ran these. Miners in the Appalachian coal fields carried them down into the dark. Farmers in the deep South used them for work that would have broken a smaller blade in 2. The bear head design, no cap bolster on the end, kept the knife light and unobtrusive despite its size. Single clip blade, rough wood or saw-cut bone handle, thick reinforcing bolster at the pivot. That was the whole knife. No ceremony, no decoration. Just enough steel to do the job that needed doing. Case made the most celebrated version, the Granddaddy Barlow No. 43, produced through the 1920s and 1940s alongside Camillus, Schrade, and Robeson. By the time Americans stopped needing to split their own kindling and butcher their own hogs, the Granddaddy had no audience left. Today, a legitimate example in good condition will cost you more than most men who owned one earned in a month. And almost nobody knows what they're looking at. But here's what nobody mentions. This wasn't just a bigger version of the same knife. It was a different tool entirely, built for a different kind of American, doing a different kind of work. The man who reached for a Granddaddy in the morning wasn't opening mail. He was building something. Here's a pattern that blade collectors know by name, but nearly everyone else has walked past in antique stores 100 times without recognizing. The equal end. Jack looks, at first glance, like a simple 2-blade folder. Symmetrical bolsters on both ends. Handle that tapers the same direction on each side. 2 blades, usually a clip and a pen, open in from the same end, understated to the point of invisibility. That symmetry was the whole point. The equal end jack was the pocket knife of the American Railroad era, the period between roughly 1880 and the 1940s, when the rail lines that stitched this country together were built, maintained, and run by human hands in conditions that would end careers today. Rail gangs worked from before sunrise to after dark. They worked in tunnels, on mountain grades, in flooded river valleys, and on prairie straightaways where the wind never stopped. They worked with their hands constantly, which meant their hands were constantly dirty, greasy, numb from cold, or slick with rain. A standard pocket knife, with one end heavier than the other, required you to orient it in your palm before opening. The equal end jack required nothing. Either end up, either end down. The knife opened correctly regardless. A man could pull it from his pocket without looking, thumb the blade open by feel alone, do what needed doing, and fold it closed again in the dark belly of a tunnel without a single wasted second. Case, Schrade, and Queen all produced equal end patterns. 2 blade versions were classified as jackknives. 3 or 4 blade versions with leaf stock blades added were classified as cattle knives, and more on those in a moment. Prices ran from about $1.50 to $3 depending on the era and the handle material. Most came in jigged bone or yellow composition handles that showed up well against dark work clothes when a man dropped one. The equal end. Jack never became fashionable. It never had a famous owner or a famous story. It was simply the knife that a working man could use in any condition, with any hand, without thinking about it. When the railroad gangs gave way to mechanized maintenance crews and the era of the human spike driver ended, the equal end jack went with them, quietly, without ceremony, exactly the way it had always worked, before the Stockman became the dominant 3-blade pattern in American pockets. And the competitor video already told you everything about the Stockman. There was the pattern that gave birth to it. The cattle knife is older, plainer, and in the opinion of the men who actually used them for the work they were designed for, more honest. The difference is in the handle and the blade selection, where the Stockman has a serpentine, slightly elegant handle shape that narrows and swells in the center. The cattle knife runs equal end, straight handle, symmetrical bolsters, no aesthetic pretension whatsoever. The blade setup was slightly different too. Most cattle knives carried a spear point, master blade, rather than a clip, paired with a spay for livestock work, and sometimes a punch blade or sheep foot for more precise cutting. The punch blade alone separated it from the Stockman entirely. That narrow, rounded tip tool for making holes in leather, marking animals, or clearing blocked veterinary needles was a piece of working equipment, not decoration. The Union Stockyards in Chicago, the largest meatpacking complex in American history at its peak, had cattle knives made with their own stamps on the tang. Knives marked Union Stockyards and produced by Napanock turned up in quantities that tell you something about how seriously that operation took the tools its workers carried. These weren't premium pieces. They were workhorses, ordered by the dozens, kept sharp and replaced when they wore out. Schrade, Case, and a dozen smaller regional cutlers produced cattle knives through the first half of the 20th century. Then the Stockman, sleeker and more versatile for the farmer who needed one knife to do everything, gradually took the cattle knife's place in production catalogs. By the 1960s, the pattern was already becoming scarce in hardware store cases. By the 1980s, it had largely disappeared from factory production. What remained was a knife that collectors occasionally pulled out of estate sales and junk store bins, often for $1 or $2, with no idea what they were holding. The predecessor to the most iconic American pocket knife pattern ever made, overlooked because it never bothered to look like anything other than what it was. There's a category of American pocket knife that existed to say something about its owner, without the owner having to say a word. The Senator was that knife. Technically, knife collectors call it the equal end pen, symmetrical handle, 2 slim blades, small enough to vanish in a vest pocket. Case produced the pattern as their number 055, manufacturing it from sometime before 1940 all the way through 1976. The handle ran about 3.5 inches closed. The blade was a slim clip, paired with an even slimmer pen blade. The whole knife, depending on handle material, weighed almost nothing. That near weightlessness was what separated it from the Congress, the penknife, and every other gentleman's folder. The Senator didn't press against your pocket. It didn't print through the fabric of fine trousers. It was there, available, sharp, capable. But it announced nothing. A man reached for it when he needed it, and forgot it existed when he didn't. The men who carried Senators in the middle part of the 20th century tended to be what you might call the professional class of rural and small-town America. Country lawyers who still knew how to saddle a horse, judges who grew up behind a plow, county sheriffs who had worked cattle before they wore a badge, state legislators from farming districts who attended sessions in the Capitol, wearing suits but kept the habits of the fields they came from. The Senator was the knife of a man caught between two worlds, the working past that shaped him and the respectable present he now occupied. It was a quiet declaration that regardless of the office or the title or the suit, there was still a blade in his pocket. He was still a man prepared to be useful. Case discontinued the pattern in 1976. By then, the world that produced the Senator's natural owner had largely dissolved. The professional class had suburbanized. The rural lawyer and the farming senator were becoming rare. The knife that suited them exactly, small, capable, unassuming, utterly dignified, had no market left to serve. Pattern break. Stop here for a moment, because something important needs to be said about what these knives actually were. They were not weapons. They were not tactical gear. They were not survival tools or prepper equipment or anything that requires a specialized vocabulary to discuss. They were work tools. Simple, functional, honest work tools that American men carried the way they carried a handkerchief or a coin. Not as equipment, but as part of what it meant to be a man ready to handle whatever the day presented. In 1950, there were roughly 150 million Americans. Pocket knife manufacturers were producing tens of millions of knives per year, year after year. The hardware store display case wasn't selling a product. It was maintaining an infrastructure, a system by which every man, regardless of his trade or his income or his geography, had the basic capacity to cut, to pry, to fix, to open, to sharpen, to prepare. The knife was the minimum threshold of readiness. A man without one in 1950 was a man who expected someone else to solve his problems. And that expectation, in that time and that place, was quietly considered a kind of failure. What happened next changed all of that, and the story is still playing out. This one is genuinely obscure. Most lifelong knife collectors have never held one. But without the budding knife, the American table looks different for 100 years. The budding knife was designed for a single precise agricultural purpose, grafting living plants. Specifically, the technique called T-budding or shield budding, where a grower cuts a T-shaped incision in the bark of a rootstock plant, lifts the bark flap with a spatula, and inserts a bud from a different, more desirable variety. Done correctly, that bud takes root and grows, and you've just transferred the genetic character of one plant onto the root structure of another. You've created an orchard variety that can be reproduced identically, year after year, with no seed variation. The budding knife's blade was short, curved, and razor-sharp, designed to make precise cuts in living bark without crushing the tissue or introducing contamination. On the opposite end of the handle, mounted flat, was a bone or ivory spatula, wide enough to slip under bark without tearing it. Two tools, one handle. Neither function possible with any other knife. The agricultural valleys of California, the San Joaquin, the Sacramento, the coastal valleys where citrus and stone fruit built empires, ran on the budding knife from the 1880s through the mid-20th century. The fruit industry that made California the agricultural center of the continent was built one grafted bud at a time. German and English cutlers produced the best early versions. American companies eventually adapted the pattern for domestic production. Every apple variety that Americans ate consistently for generations, every Gravenstein, every Delicious, every Macintosh that appeared identically in grocery stores across the country, existed because somewhere on a California hillside or an Ohio orchard, a man with a budding knife had made the right cut at the right moment on the right plant. The knife made the food system possible. Then the food system industrialized. Propagation moved into controlled nursery environments, and the pocket budding knife became the specialty tool of a dwindling community of artisan horticulturists. It still exists. It still works perfectly. But the generation of men who carried one daily, who could identify a bud from 40 yards and make the cut in 30 seconds, is almost entirely gone. In 1964, a man named Al Buck, son of the company's founder, Hoyt Buck, who had been forging knives from worn-out files since 1902, introduced something that the American knife market had never quite seen before. A large folding knife with a locking blade, a folder strong enough to do fixed blade work. A knife that could skin a deer, fillet a fish, or split a pine bough without the blade folding back into the user's hand. The Buck 110 Folding Hunter went on sale at $16 and proceeded to become one of the most produced pocket knives in American history. More than 15 million have been made. Hunters, farmers, mechanics, tradespeople, truck drivers, and construction workers across 50 years have worn that distinctive black handle and brass bolster on their belt, in a leather sheath, in the configuration that became so iconic it defined an entire category of knife for generations. But here's what the 110's famous story actually conceals. The Folding Hunter as a concept, a large, capable lock blade folder designed for outdoor and working use, predates Buck by decades. Winchester and Remington, two of the most important American arms manufacturers, produced premium folding hunters through the 1920s and 1930s in stag, bone, and pearl handles that now sell for hundreds of dollars at collector shows. These were serious tools designed for serious outdoorsmen, built to standards that reflected what American manufacturing was capable of at its peak. those pre-buck folding hunters are almost entirely forgotten now. They were eclipsed by the 110's commercial success. The way a popular sequel can make people forget an equally good original. The men who carried a Winchester folding hunter in 1935 were carrying a piece of precision American manufacturing at a time when the words "Made in America" still meant something specific about the quality of the steel, the fit of the handle, and the reliability of the mechanism. The folding hunter never disappeared. It evolved. The Buck 110 kept it alive through decades of changing fashion and shifting culture. But the full lineage, the Winchester and Remington-era, the period when these knives were refined instruments rather than mass-market products, that part of the story has gone quiet. And it deserves to be told. Pick up a Sowbelly, and the first thing you notice is the handle. It doesn't lie flat the way most pocket knives do. It curves deeply and unmistakably, like the belly of a sow pig after a winter of good feeding, which is exactly where the name came from. That pronounced serpentine curve isn't decoration, it's engineering. And once you understand what the Sowbelly was built for, the curve makes complete sense. The pattern dates to the early 1900s, originating in the cattleman's tradition of working knives, and before 1964, it was known in Case's catalog simply as the banana knife, for the obvious reason that the handle resembled one. Same pronounced curve, same deep bow in the spine, but at 4 3/4 inches, it ran larger than the later Sowbelly and carried a single hawkbill blade. The renamed, slightly smaller Sowbelly that replaced it came with 3 blades, a clip master, a sheep foot, and a spay. The same working combination as the Stockman, but in a handle that kept the blades buried deep in the frame, away from the inner thigh, and gave the working hand a grip that didn't shift under pressure. The men who needed that grip were doing work that required it. Meatpacking workers in the Chicago Union stockyards and the Kansas City packing houses, commercial fishermen on the Gulf of Mexico who needed a knife that stayed put when a hand was wet, cold, and bleeding from work. Ranch hands whose jobs combined butchering, leatherwork, and general repair in a single continuous workday that started before the sun came up. Case produced the Sowbelly until the 1940s, when the Stockman's simpler, flatter handle profile won out in the production catalogs. The Sowbelly retreated to the hands of collectors who recognized what had been lost. Tony Bowes, the legendary custom knife maker, brought it back into prominence in the modern era through his custom interpretations, which created enough demand that Case reintroduced the pattern in 2002. Slightly larger, 30 years after the original run ended, but the daily carry tradition that gave the Sowbelly its meaning, the meatpacker's morning, the fisherman's all-night golf run, the ranch hand's full day from before dawn to after dark. That tradition is not coming back. The knife survived. The life that needed it didn't. Pattern break. There's a question worth sitting with before we get to the final 3. How did this happen? How did a country that spent 300 years building a culture of daily knife carry, where the tool was as unremarkable as a set of keys, where fathers handed blades to sons as a matter of course, where hardware stores built their entire front counter display around the glass case full of folding knives. How did that culture effectively vanish within a single generation? The answer isn't simple. Part of it was the school ban wave that swept through American districts from the 1970s through the 1990s, when zero-tolerance policies meant that a boy who brought a pocket knife to school for the Boy Scout meeting on the way home faced the same consequences as one who brought it for a fight. The ritual broke at the source. Father still carried, but they had no occasion to pass the knife along because their sons had grown up in a world where carrying one was already an exception rather than a rule. Part of it was the gradual mechanization and suburbanization of American life. The tasks that made a pocket knife necessary, baling wire, feed sacks, butchering, grafting, rope work, harness repair, game skinning, were being done by machines or by specialists, or not at all. A man who commuted to an office and bought his food pre-cut in a plastic package had no daily moment that demanded a blade. And part of it was something harder to name. A slow drift away from the idea that a man should carry the tools that make him capable, rather than waiting for a store or a professional or a phone to solve what needs solving. The pocket knife was a physical expression of self-reliance. When that value faded, the knife had no philosophical home left to live in. These last 3 knives sit at the center of that story. By the time you reach this point in any honest accounting of American pocket knives, the Stockman has already been mentioned. It's unavoidable. The pattern is the most historically significant folding knife in American history, the tool that every rancher, farmer, feed store clerk, and country doctor west of the Mississippi carried from roughly 1890 through 1970. But there's a version of the Stockman that most people have never encountered and almost no one talks about. The premium Stockman, specifically the versions produced by Winchester and Remington during the 1920s and 1930s, under their own brand names as part of their cutlery lines, represented American pocket knife manufacturing at its absolute peak. These were not utility knives priced for a farmer's budget. They were precision instruments marketed to the same buyer who purchased a Winchester shotgun or a Remington rifle. A man who expected quality as a matter of course and was willing to pay for it. Winchester entered the pocket knife business in 1919. Remington followed. Both companies produced premium Stockman patterns in genuine stag and genuine bone, with chrome vanadium blades ground to tolerances that most modern production knives can't match. The bolsters fit perfectly. The walk and talk, the way the blade opened, and the sound it made when it seated into position, was tuned like a mechanical instrument. These were knives built by craftsmen in an era when American factory workers took individual pride in individual pieces, not just production numbers. A Winchester Stockman in mint condition today will sell for several $100s. A Remington in similar condition commands more. And collectors who know the history understand why. This isn't nostalgia pricing. These knives are genuinely better. Better steel, better fit, better finish than anything currently produced at their original price point in today's dollars. When both companies exited the cutlery business, Winchester in the 1940s, Remington eventually following, a chapter of American manufacturing precision closed with them. The Stockman survived in case, queen, and shade production. The premium tier did not. And with it went the understanding that a pocket knife, like a rifle or a watch, could be a precision instrument deserving of real craft. The Congress knife story begins with one of the most unlikely branding accidents in American commercial history. Sheffield cutlers were exporting these multi-blade, curved-handle knives to America in the early 19th century. Someone, the exact origin is disputed, marketed them as Congress knives, implying that this was the pattern preferred by the men who ran the country. The name stuck, and then something remarkable happened. Because people believed congressmen carried Congress knives, actual congressmen started carrying them. The advertisement became reality. The knife became the genuine carry of politicians, lawyers, editors, and men of civic standing across the American South and the political capitals of the Eastern Seaboard. In one of the more elegant feedback loops in retail history, perception manufactured truth. The most famous version of this story is Abraham Lincoln. The night he was shot at Ford's Theater in April 1865, Lincoln had a Congress knife in his pocket. That knife, 6 blades featuring a large sheepfoot, a large spear, a cuticle file, 2 pen blades, and a coping blade, is now in the Library of Congress. It is the physical record of what an American president considered essential to carry through the most consequential period in the nation's history. Not a weapon, a tool, 6 precision tools, folded into a handle that fit comfortably in a coat pocket. The 6-blade heavy Congress, sometimes called the Lincoln Congress by modern collectors, was the apex of the pattern's complexity. 4 blades was the standard. 6 was the gentleman's escalation, the version chosen by men who had more varied daily precision cutting needs, or who simply wanted the best available expression of what the Congress represented. Case, Schrade, and Cattaraugus produced them. The handles were typically pearl, stag, or high-grade bone. The price was substantial for the era. These were not knives you bought at the general store. These were knives you ordered or inherited. When ballpoint pens replaced fountain pens in the 1950s and 1960s, 2 of the Congress's core functions, trimming quill pens, which it had originally been designed for, and keeping fountain pen nibs clean and shaped, simply disappeared. 2 blades without a job. The pattern retreated into the collector's world, where it remains a prized and expensive piece. But its daily carry life ended with the culture that gave it meaning. The age of the man who opened letters with a fine blade and trimmed his cigars with a precise edge and carried the weight of civic responsibility in his coat pocket. That age is done. The most important knife on this list was never fashionable. It was never carried because it looked good or announced something about its owner's taste or station. It was carried because lives depended on it, literally. Before the modern era of sterilized surgical theaters and disposable instruments, the American field surgeon worked with what he could fit in his coat. Military surgeons during the Civil War carried multi-blade folding knives as primary instruments for procedures that had to be performed in the field, often within hours of the injury, without access to a hospital or a supply cache. The 4-blade heavy Congress, with its sheepfoot for controlled incisions, its spear for penetration, its smaller pen blade for precision work, and its flat spine blade for separating tissue, was not designed to be a surgical kit. But it became one in the hands of men who understood what each blade could do. Rural doctors in the decades following the Civil War carried the same basic tool. A country physician in 1885, riding his circuit through farms and homesteads 60 miles from the nearest town, had to be prepared to handle anything. A difficult delivery, a laceration that wouldn't close, an abscess that needed opening before it became fatal, a deep wound from farm machinery that required exploration and debridement before the patient bled out. The multi-blade heavy Congress, in combination with the physician's specific training and improvised ingenuity, was the difference between life and death in situations that never appeared in the official case studies. The medical profession standardized and specialized through the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Purpose-made surgical instruments, sterilizable and reusable, replaced the physician's personal carry. The country doctors, Congress went into a coat pocket and eventually into a drawer. The need it once filled, the need for a multi-purpose precision-cutting instrument that a single man could carry anywhere, never fully disappeared. It just found different forms. There's an argument that every multi-tool ever made, from the Swiss Army knife to the Leatherman, is the direct descendant of that physician's folding Congress. The idea that one pocketed instrument should handle as many distinct precision tasks as possible, because you never know which one the moment will demand. That idea is old. It was already old when it rode circuit with a country doctor in 1880. And it is the reason this knife, more than any other on this list, deserves to be called the most important forgotten blade in American history. The 10 knives on this list didn't fail. They didn't wear out or fall apart or prove unequal to the work. They were retired by a country that stopped doing the work that required them. The Granddaddy Barlow lost its audience when men stopped splitting their own timber. The budding knife lost its market when orchards industrialized. The field surgeon's congress became obsolete when the country doctor's circuit gave way to the rural hospital. Each disappearance was a small surrender of a specific kind of human competence. And here's the uncomfortable part. The competence didn't disappear because it became unnecessary. It disappeared because we transferred it to machines, to specialists, to systems we don't fully understand and can't maintain ourselves. The trade seemed reasonable at the time. It usually does. Next time you open a kitchen drawer and reach past the junk to get to something useful, check what's in there. There might be an old folding knife with bone handles that's been sitting in the dark for 30 years. Pick it up. Feel the weight of it. That knife was designed for a specific moment in a specific life, by men who understood that the distance between capable and helpless is exactly the length of a blade. It still works. The question is whether you do.